Welcome to Channel 24. Today I'm joined by Mick Ryan, a retired Major General of the Australian Army, a military strategist, and one of the sharpest analysts of modern warfare. He has been following Ukraine's war closely, writing about drones, long-range strikes, military adaptation, and how this war is changing the future of the world. General Ryan, it's always a pleasure to have you here. Welcome.
Thanks, Natalie. It's good to be with you again.
And just one notification for our viewers. Please subscribe on our channel, and please subscribe on my own channel, Not Just Politics. I've just created it. And also please subscribe on social media. Oh, General Ryan, you will find a lot of analysis of the Russian war in Ukraine, and not only. So, General Ryan, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelenskyy and General Alexander Syrsky have warned seriously about possible Russian plans from the north of Ukraine. At the same time, from the Belarusian side. At the same time, Alexander Lukashenko, the self-proclaimed leader of Belarus, has been trying to build a new diplomatic track with Washington and has also spoken about dialogue with Zelenskyy unexpectedly. How should we read this contradiction? Does it reduce the risk of Belarus being used against Ukraine? Or is Belarus still a Russian military platform that Moscow can use whenever they want?
Well, the risk from Belarus never went away. I mean, the Russian forces launched some of their large-scale, full-scale invasion in 2022 from Belarusian territory. And whilst the Battle of Kiev was won by Ukraine and the Russians had to withdraw to the north, the threat from Belarus has never quite gone away. Belarus has provided airfields, it's provided munitions to Russia, it's provided a location for Russia to do recent nuclear weapons drills. So the Ukrainian military has never taken its eye off the northern border, but at the same time, Lukashenko has never indicated he'd like to be a direct participant in this war, and I find that unlikely to change at this point.
General Ryan, in your latest piece on social media, you wrote that Ukraine's strike on Moscow was not just a propaganda event, but part of a long-range campaign built over years. And last night, actually, there was also reports of explosion in Yaroslavl in Russia, with the locals saying they heard around 20 drones blasts and explosions. Would you call this a justice or a real tactical advantage for Ukraine?
Well, what we're seeing is a lot of hard work, blood, sweat and tears from Ukrainians over the last 4 years in developing a long-range strike system starting to really come to fruition. Ukraine now has a very broad range of long-range attack weapons, those developed in Ukraine as well as those provided by Western partners. It's improved all the way along in the planning for these attacks, along with Western intelligence. And it's started to really significantly degrade Russia's air defence system, which then ends up broadening the number of targets that Ukraine can strike. It's very hard to see Russia recovering its poise in its air defence, and Ukraine is certainly ahead of Russia when it comes to effectiveness in long-range strike at the moment.
I've heard even on Russian propaganda, they admitting that Ukraine ahead of Russia at some points, especially when we're speaking about the drones, right? And speaking about another success of Ukraine, Ukraine says it struck an FSB headquarters in the occupied part of the Kherson region with around 100 Russian personnel killed. And also, we struck a Panzer air defense system destroyed. Why is this target so painful to Russia, not only militarily, but politically, given the fact that FSB's role in controlling occupied territories are huge?
Yeah, I think this was a very successful strike, not only because of FSB's current role, but its role in planning the original full-scale invasion, as well as the occupation, the illegal occupation of Crimea. So it was a very useful strike for Ukraine to kill as many Russian intelligence officers as possible. But it also shows that the Russians are still concentrating people in headquarters and not able to go through the same kind of force protection measures that Ukraine has long adopted to protect its headquarters. So I think it had a lot of benefits for Ukraine, and it will continue to look for these kind of targets.
Valery Zaluzhny, Ukraine's former commander-in-chief and now Ukraine's ambassador to the United Kingdom, has warned that the future world order must not have gray zones. And he says in his new article piece that if a country is left a buffer zone, war will come, definitely. Is Ukraine's experience the clearest proof that gray zones in European security do not prevent war, but they actually invite it?
Well, possibly. I mean, there are examples where grey zones have prevented wars. I think the Korean Peninsula is a place where there's been the demilitarised zone, the grey zone, for, well on 75 years now, and that has been a key part of separating the forces. So not only are these grey zones a source of tension, but they're also a way of separating forces so they can't have accidental engagements that might lead to escalation. So whilst there's some truth to the grey zones being a source of tension, they can also be a source of de-escalation.
Do you think Europe finally will stop treating Ukraine as a buffer zone between Russia and the rest of Europe?
I'm not sure that it sees Ukraine as a buffer zone, but it certainly sees it as a frontline state. Just as it sees the Baltics as frontline states in the struggle to contain and deter Russian aggression. So I think the thinking is a little more sophisticated than as a buffer. That's, I guess, a synonym that some would use. But at the end of the day, Ukraine and several other countries, Finland as well, are frontline states. And NATO is supporting all those frontline states, including Ukraine, to contain Russia and deter aggression.
The Atlantic Council also writes that Ukraine's experience can teach Europe how to defend itself against Russia in the future. And modern European armies, they say, are well organized, they well equipped and well trained, but often for the wars of the past. And you were also saying that not only once. Could this become fatal if Europe does not adapt fast enough to drones, electronic warfare, mass strikes, and battlefield innovation?
Absolutely. I mean, military organisations are inherently conservative, and we have a long history of preparing for the last war, not the next one. And there's no better example of that than the ongoing war in Ukraine, where a lot of countries were caught short by Iranian Shahed drone attacks. Ukraine has been suffering these attacks for more than 4 years. It has developed low-cost interceptors and been using them for 12 to 18 months. But the rest of the world didn't learn this lesson. So I think it's an important insight that we can fail to learn, and we need to speed up learning and speed up investment in the different kind of weapons that we'll need to succeed in the 21st century and deter countries like Russia and China and Iran.
The US government has approved a possible $100.8 million sale of equipment to support Ukraine's Hawk air defense systems. And Hawk is not a new system, but Ukraine needs every layer of an air defense for us. How important is this kind of a support when Russia is trying to overwhelm Ukrainian cities with drones and missiles?
Well, Ukraine still uses American weapons systems, not just the Hawk, but also more sophisticated missile systems like the Patriot and a range of other equipment and munitions as well. And support from the originating country where it was designed, where it's built, where spare parts, where modernisation programs are run is really important. So even though the Hawk is an older missile, it has been upgraded and modernised and can be used for certain kinds of targets. It's not being used to target fifth-generation fighter jets, but it can target certain kinds of lower-end targets.
We previously discussed with you a successful Ukrainian army strikes deep into Russia. And General Ryan, from your perspective, how difficult is to balance offensive long-range strikes with the defense of Ukrainian cities?
Well, the reality is, and this is, Ukraine's strategy, is you've got to do both. And it's very hard sometimes to juggle the resources and the manpower required to be able to do both, especially when it comes to drone forces. But you have to be able to do both. You have to be able to defend on one hand and strike out on the other to make the Russians suffer far more than the Russians have made Ukraine suffer over the last, 12 years of war in Ukraine. So you've got to be able to do both. The real art, the real strategy is getting that balance right, and that's what the President and Ministry of Defence and the Minister are all about.
General Ryan, there is an interesting thing and situation with the U.S. troops in Europe. The United States is pulling thousands of troops out of Germany, but Donald Trump has also spoken about sending 5,000 troops to Poland. That was on the debates and discussable, but now he just posted that on social media and he has decided. How do you read this decision inside NATO?
I think NATO will take it with a grain of salt. At the end of the day, the balance of US troops across the continent will remain roughly the same, even though there will be a rebalancing between Germany and Poland. Let's not forget there will still be around 30,000 US troops in Germany undertaking a range of very important headquarters, logistics, combat and transport functions that are important, not just to the United States, but to NATO. So yes, there's going to be a bit of a drawdown in Germany, but there's going to be a bit of a plus up in Poland, which is a good thing.
General Ryan, we haven't discussed Putin going to China. So he went to Beijing, he was talking about friendship with China, and Xi Jinping was answering mutually, I would say. So they were talking about the energy and new world order, signed like dozens of documents. But Russia's economy is still increasingly dependent on China. Does Beijing make Russia stronger by keeping it alive, or weaker because Moscow becomes more and more dependent on China every year, on every step?
Well, in the short term, it is certainly the key enabler for Putin's war against Ukraine and its war of subversion and sabotage against the rest of Europe. It's very clear that China has provided a range of dual-use manufacturers for Russia. It's procured a lot of its energy, providing important money for Putin to fight his war. It's clearly providing support in the way of diplomacy and misinformation. That's not going to change, and it certainly has assisted Putin over the last few years and will in the short term. In the longer term, as we see Russia's economy continue to degrade, its population continue to decline. China took over the leading hand in that relationship some time ago, and the balance of power between China and Russia will continue to widen. The talks in Beijing this week really will have been used by Putin, firstly, to shore up his war effort, but secondly, following on the coattails of Donald Trump, for Putin to still project that he is the leader of a powerful nation. That's not quite true anymore, but the projection of that message is still important to Putin.
Yeah. I'm reading right now the article from Bloomberg, and they're saying that Putin wants to end the war in Ukraine by the end of the year, but only on terms of Russia, which means full control of the Donbas region and broader security guarantees from Europe that would effectively recognize Russia's territorial gains in Ukraine. At the same time, Dmitry Peskov, spokesman of Putin, recently said that in China, actually, and I think that was the most honest thing that they have said in China, that they are not going to end special military operation. So basically, what we have to understand from all of these messages?
Well, I think we saw Putin say he wanted the war to end quickly back in 2022. I think 10 days was he wanted it to end. And regardless of what kind of benchmark on when he wants the war to end is, he has never changed his goals for this war, which is the subjugation of Ukraine, which is not acceptable to Ukraine or to Europe. So he hasn't really changed his stripes. All he's doing is using weasel words to try and convince Donald Trump to ensure he continues supporting Putin over Zelensky.
Absolutely. My final one, General Ryan. I was reading the article of a Sweden's foreign minister. She published an opinion piece in the New York Times arguing that Russia's economy is much weaker than it looks, and that the West should increase pressure instead of waiting for Putin to choose peace, which is not happening, as you said. And after that, one harsh phrase I was reading on social media, and it started circulating online, that now is the time to finish the beast. The only question is what to do with the carcass of post-Putin Russia. And it's not her quote, but I liked it. So, General Ryan, is the real strategic question now how to make Russia too weak to continue this war, and how to prepare for what comes after Putin?
Yeah, I think it's an important question. Firstly, I mean, war is a bit like a boxing match. You need to punch your opponent in every part of their body that you possibly can to find as many weak spots as possible. And it's the same with Russia. We need to hit them economically, militarily, diplomatically, with information, every single way to weaken them overall. I mean, the thing, if there is a fall of Putin, we just need to be careful. Sometimes the devil you know is better the devil you don't. I don't think it's the case here, but generally when there's a regime change in Russia, which doesn't happen that often, it's pretty big. If Russia loses this war, I think the West needs to be very careful not to be as magnanimous as it was at the end of the Cold War. Russia was never really taught a lesson that it had lost the war, so it could have all these narratives that we see out of Putin now about their role in the world, and that, you know, they're at war with NATO but haven't been beaten. They were beaten in 1991, and if they lose this war, they need to know without any doubt that Russia lost, and there needs to be a cost to pay for Russia.
Yeah, you know, and this nuclear drills between Russia and Belarus just ahead of this China visit of dictator Putin. And I was like, maybe that's the last card that they have, and they just, you know, they're playing this card because they have nothing to lose. I mean, I don't want to sound like super optimistic, but still, I see that they are just losing their positions dramatically in the world.
I think President Zelenskyy has far more cards than President Putin.
Absolutely. General Ryan, thank you so much for your time, and I hope to see you soon on our channel. Thank you.
Thanks, Natalie. It's always a pleasure.